When people hear the name Steve Jobs, they often imagine a genius, a man who reshaped the world through pure vision and will. But behind the myth, behind the clean lines of every Apple product, was a man whose inner world was anything but simple. Jobs wasn't only building computers, he was searching for meaning. Every pixel, every curve, every word he approved carried a kind of hunger, a desire to make sense of life through creation. He once said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." But what drives a person to want to change the world? Is it ambition? Or is it something deeper? A longing to find order in a life that so often feels uncertain, fleeting, incomplete. Steve Jobs lived at the intersection of opposites: innovation and perfection, control and chaos, success and failure. He sought beauty in function and purpose in simplicity. But this journey wasn't only about design, it was about identity. He wasn't content to simply live in the world, he wanted to shape it, to leave a mark that would last beyond his years. And yet, the more he shaped the world around him, the more he faced the question that haunts every human being. What is the purpose of all this? Fame, wealth, power. These things came early for him. But meaning is harder to build. It cannot be engineered. It cannot be assembled from parts. It must be found or remembered within. To understand Steve Jobs, we must look past the headlines, past the product launches, past the legend. We must look at a man who wrestled with life's oldest questions, through technology, through failure, through silence. He was a visionary, yes. But vision, when stripped of humility, can become blindness. And Jobs' life reminds us that even the brightest minds must eventually face the same truth as everyone else, that creation without reflection is empty, and success without purpose is fragile. His story isn't just about brilliance. It's about struggle, the quiet, unseen kind that lives behind achievement. It's about a man trying to design not just machines, but meaning. He believed deeply that beauty mattered, that even inside a computer, unseen by the user, there should be elegance, discipline, and care. Because to him, work reflected the soul. And how you did one thing was how you did everything. But there was a cost to such intensity. Genius rarely travels alone. It often walks beside restlessness, impatience, and the inability to accept imperfection. And yet, even in this imperfection, we find the paradox that defines his life. He wanted control, but life kept reminding him that control is temporary. He wanted permanence, but everything he built existed in a world that constantly changed. So perhaps the true lesson of Steve Jobs isn't in the products he made, but in the questions his life raises. What are we really trying to perfect our creations, or ourselves? Can innovation bring peace? Can control bring meaning? Or does real fulfillment come from something quieter, not in conquering the world, but in learning to live wisely within it? This is where our journey begins, not with the myth of the visionary, but with the human being behind it. A man who built the tools that connected millions, while still trying to understand what connection truly means. Part 2. The child who saw differently. Before the world knew him as a visionary, he was simply a boy, quiet, curious, often restless. Steve Jobs grew up in a small home in California, in a world just beginning to change. While other children were content to play, he wanted to understand. He would take things apart, radios, watches, circuits, not to destroy them, but to see what lay beneath. He believed that to truly know something, you had to see it from the inside. That curiosity became the foundation of his life. A hunger to see what others overlooked, to question what others accepted, to find clarity where others saw only confusion. From an early age, he learned that reality is shaped not only by what exists, but by how we perceive it. And that realization that perception can be shaped stayed with him forever. He saw beauty not just in art, but in precision. He saw creativity not as chaos, but as discipline. And he began to believe that the boundary between science and art was an illusion. To him, design was not decoration, it was harmony. It was truth made visible. But behind that sharp mind was also a restless soul. Jobs never accepted things as they were. He wanted life to make sense, to be coherent, deliberate, purposeful. And when it wasn't, he felt something deeper, a quiet unease, a sense that the world was missing something essential. In his teenage years, he became fascinated by philosophy, by reflection, by silence. He read about stillness and focus, and he practiced moments of quiet thought not to escape the world, but to understand it more clearly. He would walk long distances, alone, with no music, letting thoughts rise and fall, learning that silence, too, can speak. This early search for meaning gave him something rare, a habit of questioning his own mind. He learned that creativity is not only about adding more, but about removing what doesn't belong. He would later call this the discipline of simplicity. And in that discipline was a lesson many overlook, that greatness often begins not with knowing more, but with seeing clearly. Jobs' childhood wasn't extraordinary in events, but it was extraordinary in perception. He looked at the same world as everyone else, yet somehow he saw it differently. Where others saw limitations, he saw possibility. Where others saw technology, he saw potential for expression. Where others accepted what was, he imagined what could be. It's easy to think of genius as something mystical, as if some people are simply born different. But perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps genius is just the courage to question the familiar and the patience to look a little longer than most. In this way, Steve Jobs' mind was never at rest, not because he wanted more, but because he refused to stop asking why. And it was this restless curiosity, this inability to accept the ordinary, that would later become both his gift and his burden. The child who saw differently would grow into a man who demanded that others see differently too. But in doing so, he would learn that vision comes with a cost. Because when you see the world as it could be, you can never fully accept it as it is. And so began his lifelong struggle between imagination and reality, between perfection and peace, between control and acceptance. He didn't yet know it, but the questions that guided him as a child would become the same questions that shaped his entire life. Part 3. The Beauty of Simplicity. It sounds easy, but in truth, it is one of the hardest things a person can ever master. Most people believe that complexity shows intelligence, that the more intricate, the more advanced, the more impressive something is, the more it must matter. But Steve Jobs believed the opposite. He believed that simplicity was the ultimate form of sophistication, not because it was easy, but because it required discipline. To make something simple is to understand it completely, to remove what is unnecessary until only what matters remains. Jobs was obsessed with this idea not just in design, but in life. He wanted his products, his company, even his words, to reflect a kind of purity. No distractions, no clutter, no noise. He once said, "Simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean." Clean thinking. That's what he strived for. This wasn't only about technology. It was about a way of seeing. To him, simplicity was not the absence of depth, but the presence of clarity. It was not the lack of choice, but the alignment of purpose. And when you think about it, isn't that what we all search for? Clarity? A sense of what truly matters. To know which parts of life to hold on to and which to let go. Simplicity, in its truest form, is not about having less. It's about being less distracted. It's about seeing what is essential and removing what hides it. Jobs didn't want his designs to shout. He wanted them to feel silent, peaceful, balanced, complete. He once rejected hundreds of versions of a single design because one line, one curve, one shade of color didn't feel right. Not because he was obsessed with control for its own sake, but because he believed that beauty has a kind of order, that when something is designed well, you can feel its truth. There's a quiet wisdom in that idea. Because in every part of life, from our thoughts to our relationships to our work, clarity brings peace. When we remove what is unnecessary, we create space for meaning. Jobs wasn't chasing simplicity to impress anyone. He chased it because he understood that confusion clouds the mind and order clears it. He believed that when things are simple, we can see their essence, and through that essence, we connect with something deeper, a sense of purpose, of alignment, of peace. But simplicity demands sacrifice. To create something truly pure, you must be willing to say no to ideas, to distractions, even to your own impulses. And that kind of restraint requires strength. In his work, Jobs taught his teams to care about what the eye couldn't see. Even the inside of a computer unseen by users had to be beautiful. Because integrity, he said, is what you do when no one is watching. He believed that the things we create are reflections of who we are inside. That our attention to detail, our patience, our pursuit of harmony all reveal the quality of our inner life. In that sense, simplicity wasn't only aesthetic. It was moral. It was spiritual. It was a mirror of the soul. And yet, the paradox remained. In his pursuit of simplicity, Jobs' life itself was rarely simple. He demanded clarity from others, while often struggling to find peace within himself. He designed calmness, but lived in intensity. He built harmony in objects, while wrestling with chaos and emotion. Maybe that's what made his work so powerful. It was a reflection of what he longed for: simplicity, balance, stillness. Qualities he could design into the world, even when he couldn't always find them in himself. In a way, we all do this. We build what we miss. We search for outward order to calm the noise inside. And sometimes, in creating something pure, we come a little closer to understanding what purity truly means. Jobs taught that true simplicity is not about making things easier, but about making them honest. About removing the unnecessary until what remains feels complete. Not because it is perfect, but because it is true. Part 4. The Obsession with Control. A word that carries both power and fragility. We all seek it in our lives, in our work, in the way we are seen. It gives us comfort. It gives us structure. It gives us the illusion that we are safe. For Steve Jobs, control wasn't just a preference. It was a necessity, the lens through which he saw the world. He believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth shaping completely. Every detail mattered. Every pixel, every screw, every sound, every silence. He once said, "People don't know what they want until you show it to them." It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. He believed that excellence could not be built by committee. It required vision. And vision demanded control. He wanted to design not just products, but experiences. He wanted the feel of the box, the sound of the startup tone, the click of the sex button, all of it to reflect one idea, one essence. He didn't see technology as neutral. He saw it as an extension of human intention. And because intention mattered, every part of the process had to be pure. But control, like fire, can illuminate or consume. The more you tighten your grip, the more fragile things become. And Jobs, in his pursuit of perfection, often found himself wrestling with the limits of that control. He demanded precision from others that he struggled to grant himself. He expected greatness without always understanding the cost it required from those around him. Colleagues admired him, feared him, and sometimes resented him. They said he could distort reality, that his belief in what was possible was so strong it could make others believe it too. And sometimes it worked. But other times it left people broken, confused, exhausted. It's easy to criticize that kind of intensity. But if you look closer, you see a man not driven by pride, but by fear. The fear of chaos, of mediocrity, of a world left unfinished. Jobs lived with a sense of urgency. He knew life was short, and he wanted everything he touched to carry meaning, clarity, and order. He couldn't stand the idea that something as fragile as life would be wasted on something careless. But in that drive was also a quiet struggle. Because life, by nature, resists control. No matter how precise the plan, no matter how perfect the design, something always escapes us. You can perfect a product, but you cannot perfect the world. You can command a team, but not the passage of time. You can craft a message, but not the heart of the person who hears it. Jobs fought this truth for much of his life, the truth that control brings order, but not peace. He wanted both, but the two rarely coexist. In his office there was a sign that read, "The journey is the reward." It sounds simple, but for Jobs, it was more of a reminder that creation was not only about the destination, but about the act itself. Yet even that idea reveals a paradox. How can the journey be the reward for someone who wants to perfect every step of it? How can you find joy in a process if you cannot accept its flaws? These are questions that follow anyone who seeks mastery over their world. Because mastery, without humility, leads to exhaustion, not excellence. And control without surrender becomes a prison disguised as progress. But Jobs wasn't blind to this. He sensed it, especially in the quiet hours, when the noise of success faded. He often said he wanted Apple to stand at the intersection of technology and humanity, and that word humanity was his greatest contradiction. To be human is to be limited, to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to lose control, to learn, to grow. And perhaps, deep down, Jobs' obsession with control wasn't about power at all, but about longing for peace in a world that never stands still. He wanted order in the chaos of existence. He wanted beauty in the uncertainty of time. He wanted permanence in the face of death. And he tried to build it, not through religion, not through philosophy, but through design, through simplicity, through detail. Every product he built was his way of saying, "This is how the world should feel: clean, precise, calm." But no matter how perfect the design, life always slipped through the cracks. Because control can only reach so far. The truth is, control can guide you, but it cannot save you. It can shape your work, but not your heart. It can build structure, but not meaning. Meaning, Jobs would discover later, comes from acceptance. From knowing that control may bring order, but only surrender brings peace. Still, his obsession gave us something undeniable, a vision of what is possible when focus meets devotion. And perhaps, for all his flaws, his legacy is not in how much he controlled, but in how much he cared. He cared deeply, too deeply, sometimes about what the world could be. And maybe that, in the end, is what made him both brilliant and human. To care so much that even the smallest imperfection matters. To want things to be better, even when the cost is high. To chase order, even in a life that will never be fully in your hands. Because perhaps that is what creation truly is. Not control, but devotion. The act of giving yourself fully to something that will never be perfect and doing it anyway. Part 5. The Ego and the Shadow. There are two sides to every human being. The one we show the world, and the one we quietly battle within. Steve Jobs was admired for his confidence. His words carried certainty, his presence demanded attention, his vision seemed unshakable. But behind that brilliance was a man constantly wrestling with his own shadow. He wanted to create perfection, but within himself, he knew imperfection. He wanted harmony, but often created conflict. He sought truth, but struggled to live with the limits of being human. This is not hypocrisy, it is humanity. We all carry this tension, the desire to do good, and the ego that whispers, "Make it about you." Jobs' ego was both his gift and his trial. It gave him drive, but it also blinded him. He demanded excellence not only from his team, but from the world itself. And when the world failed to meet that vision, he grew angry, disappointed, sometimes cruel. He saw potential in others, but when they could not see it themselves, he lost patience. To him, mediocrity was not a weakness, it was a sin against possibility. And yet, behind that impatience was something fragile, a man afraid of meaninglessness. He once said that death was the best invention of life. He didn't mean it coldly, he meant that death is what makes time precious, that it forces us to ask what matters. But that awareness also haunted him. He feared wasting time. He feared not fulfilling his purpose. He feared leaving this world without having made something that truly mattered. That fear, that urgency, often spoke through his ego. When he raised his voice, when he pushed too hard, when he demanded the impossible, it wasn't always arrogance. Sometimes it was desperation. A cry from a man who wanted to give meaning to the briefness of life. But the ego has a way of convincing us that the world must bend to our will. It tells us that we can fix everything if we just try hard enough. It tells us that we are right, that our vision is the truth, that others simply don't understand. Jobs believed he could shape reality, and, in many ways, he did. But reality does not always obey the mind, and when it resisted, he felt pain, the kind that comes when control meets limitation. He didn't always treat people kindly. He could be sharp, dismissive, impatient. There were times when his words cut deeper than he intended. But even those who suffered under his intensity often said the same thing. He pushed us to be better. They didn't admire his temper, but they respected his purpose. Because beneath his harshness was a man who cared deeply, too deeply, perhaps about the beauty of what could be. This is the shadow of passion, when our love for creation turns into obsession, when devotion to excellence turns into anger at imperfection. And yet, every person who creates, every person who dreams, must face this shadow. The ego wants to own the work. But real creation requires humility, because nothing made by human hands is ever perfect, and nothing meaningful is ever made without struggle. In the end, Steve Jobs' ego didn't make him a monster. It made him human. He was a mirror of our own contradictions, our need to matter, our fear of failure, our longing for greatness, and our battle to stay kind along the way. He lived in a world that rewarded achievement more than character, and perhaps that's why he fought so hard, because the voice inside him knew that greatness means nothing if it comes at the cost of peace. But there is something redeeming in his story, because even as he hurt people, even as he clashed with those around him, he was not blind to his flaws. He reflected, he learned, he changed. With time, the sharp edges softened. He learned to apologize. He learned to listen. He learned that vision alone isn't enough. It must be guided by compassion. And perhaps that is the real test of a human being. Not whether we are perfect, but whether we are willing to grow. Jobs' journey reminds us that brilliance without humility is incomplete, and that our shadow, the part of us we hide, the part we fear, is not our enemy. It is our teacher. It shows us where we are still attached, where we are still afraid, where we still confuse control for meaning. To face the shadow is to face ourselves. To admit that beneath every act of creation lies a mixture of light and dark, of purpose and pride, of hope and fear. But when we face that truth honestly, without denial, without arrogance, we grow closer to sincerity. We begin to act not from ego, but from awareness. And that quietly, humbly, is what transforms a life from achievement into wisdom. Because in the end, what truly matters is not how great we appear, but how honestly we live. Not how much we control, but how much we understand. Not how loudly the world remembers us, but how deeply we learn to see ourselves. Part 6, Creation, as a spiritual act. To create is human. It is one of the purest expressions of what we are capable of. But for Steve Jobs, creation wasn't just work. It was a way of being, a kind of devotion, a language through which he tried to understand himself and the world around him. Jobs believed that when we make something, it should reflect not only our intelligence, but our care, our sense of purpose, our respect for beauty, our gratitude for existence itself. He once said that the act of creation is not about adding more things, but about finding what is essential and revealing it with honesty. To him, design was not decoration. It was intention made visible. It was clarity given form. It was the quiet meeting point between thought and action. This is what made him so demanding. He believed that every creation carried the maker's soul within it. that carelessness left a mark, just as sincerity did. He would look at a product, a curve, a color, a surface, and ask, "Does this show respect for the person who will hold it?" Because, to him, creation was not about showing power. It was about serving people, giving them something that worked so beautifully, so seamlessly, that they didn't even have to think about it. That was his goal, to make technology disappear into simplicity, to make the tool vanish so that only the experience remained. And in that pursuit, there was something almost sacred. Because real creation, honest creation, requires humility. You must listen more than you speak. You must observe before you act. You must care more about the purpose than the praise. Jobs believed that craftsmanship was a kind of truth-telling, that the quality of what you build reveals the quality of your attention, and attention, when given fully, is one of the rarest forms of respect. He often said that making something great was an act of love. Not love for recognition, but love for the process itself, for the details, the unseen parts, the quiet perfection that no one else might notice. And that's what made his products feel alive. They carried a human presence, the trace of care, the echo of patience. He demanded this from his teams, that they see their work as something moral, something meaningful, that they give their best, not because someone was watching, but because that's what integrity means, to give your best, even in silence. There's a deeper truth here, one that extends beyond work. Creation, in any form, is a reflection of gratitude. When we create, we acknowledge that life itself is a gift, that we are entrusted with time, with ability, with imagination, and that to use them well is a way of honoring that trust. In every great creation, there is a moment when the maker steps back and feels a quiet awe, not pride, but gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to bring something new into existence. Gratitude for the materials, the time, the guidance, the inspiration. Gratitude for being part of something bigger than oneself. Jobs rarely spoke of faith, but his approach to creation carried the essence of it: discipline, devotion, patience, and a deep respect for the invisible. Because to create is to believe that something more is possible. It is to trust that effort has meaning, that care has power, that beauty matters. And in that way, creation becomes a kind of prayer, not in words, but in action. A humble recognition that the ability to make, to design, to improve, is itself a gift. Jobs once said that real artists ship, meaning that creation isn't complete until it is shared. That the purpose of building something beautiful is not to keep it hidden, but to let it serve others. To make life a little clearer, a little easier, a little more human. He believed that work done with love has a way of lasting beyond its maker. That even after we are gone, what we create, if built with care, continues to speak for us. And that is the quiet legacy of all true creation. Not fame, not wealth, not perfection, but sincerity. The unseen quality that gives life meaning. Because the act of creation is, at its heart, an act of gratitude. It says, "I was given this time, these tools, this ability, and I used them well." And that in its simplicity, its honesty, its humility, is what makes creation more than an action. It makes it a form of worship through work, a way of saying thank you for the chance to build something beautiful in a world that often forgets what beauty means. Part 7. Failure and rebirth failure. It is a word we spend most of our lives trying to avoid. We are taught to hide from it, to fear it, to see it as the end of something, a door that closes and never opens again. But for Steve Jobs, failure was not an ending, it was a beginning. In 1985, at the height of his success, he was forced out of the very company he created, Apple. His vision, his life's work, was no longer his. The man who had built an empire was suddenly left with nothing. He later said it was one of the most public failures of his life. And yet, looking back, he called it one of the best things that ever happened to him. Because sometimes, life takes away what we think defines us, so that we can rediscover who we really are. In those years away from Apple, Jobs was stripped of titles, applause, and power. But in that emptiness, he found something else: clarity. freedom. A renewed sense of purpose, unclouded by ego. He built again from nothing. He started a new company called NXT and invested in a small animation studio that would later become Pixar. He poured his heart into creating, not for fame, but because he could not stop. Creation, for him, was a form of breathing, something he did not to be remembered, but to stay alive. And slowly, in the quiet spaces of failure, he began to rebuild not only his career, but himself. There's a lesson in that silence. When we lose what we thought we needed most, we are forced to confront what truly sustains us. When the noise fades, we learn what remains. Jobs could have given up. He could have lived in bitterness or regret, but instead, he chose to keep creating, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. He once said, "Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith." And in those words lies something universal, because every life, no matter how brilliant, is shaped by struggle. Every dream passes through the valley of doubt. Every soul must learn to rebuild after being broken. Failure humbles us. It strips away illusion. It shows us that our worth is not in what we own, but in what we are willing to try again for. And Jobs did. He returned to Apple years later, not as the same man who had left, but as someone transformed. Quieter, more patient, more deliberate. He had learned that greatness does not come from never falling, but from rising with wisdom after you do. He came back not to prove something, but to build something meaningful again. And with that renewed sense of purpose, he created some of Apple's most iconic designs, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone. They were not just products. They were symbols of rebirth. Each represented simplicity after chaos, clarity after confusion, renewal after loss. But perhaps the most important transformation wasn't in Apple, it was in Jobs himself. He learned that failure had been his greatest teacher. It taught him humility. It taught him patience. It taught him that even when you lose everything, you can begin again. And in that beginning, he found a deeper kind of strength, not the strength to control, but the strength to accept. We all face moments when the things we love are taken from us. A dream collapses. A plan fails. A door closes. And in those moments, we are tempted to believe that the story is over. But often, it is in those very moments that life is quietly rewriting us, shaping us into something truer, wiser, and more sincere. Jobs' life reminds us that failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of it. It is the soil from which growth emerges. When everything falls apart, it forces us to see what cannot be broken. And sometimes, the pieces we put back together create something stronger than what was there before. Rebirth rarely feels beautiful in the moment. It feels painful, uncertain, lonely. But looking back, we often realize that the breaking was necessary for the becoming. And so, Steve Jobs' greatest achievement was not Apple. It was not the iPhone. It was not even his legacy. It was that he learned to start over. He learned that creation is not about avoiding failure, but about walking through it with patience, faith, and gratitude. Because the truth is this: the things we lose are often not taken from us. They are returned to life so that we can meet them again as better, wiser versions of ourselves. Part 8. Mortality and Meaning. There comes a moment in every life when the illusion of forever begins to fade, when the horizon of time, once distant and invisible, suddenly becomes clear. For Steve Jobs, that moment arrived far earlier than he expected. In 2003, he was diagnosed with cancer. At first, he resisted treatment not out of denial, but out of hope that it might not be real. He searched for alternatives, for ways to fix what could not be fixed by control or design. For the first time, he was forced to face a truth that not even his brilliance could outthink: that life itself has limits. All his life, Jobs had believed that discipline and vision could shape the world. That through focus and willpower, you could bend reality. And for years, that belief had worked. He had built, shaped, created, inspired. But illness doesn't listen to ambition. It humbles everyone equally. For a man who built his life around control, this was the one thing he could not master. And in that loss of control, something within him began to change. He once said in a speech, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." That was not the voice of arrogance. It was the voice of awakening. Death, the one truth that equalizes all of us, had become his teacher. He began to see time not as something to manage, but as something to honor. Each day no longer a line on a calendar, but a gift, a class, fleeting, fragile opportunity to create, to love, to reflect, to be grateful. He had always been aware of mortality in theory, but now it was no longer a concept. It was a reality. And in that reality, he discovered something he had overlooked his entire life. That meaning is not found in what we build, but in how we live while building it. For the first time, the man who had obsessed over every detail of a screen began to notice the details of life itself, the sound of the wind, the warmth of sunlight, the presence of his family, the silence between breaths. Illness slowed him down, and in that slowing, he found a kind of peace he had never known. He once described death not as an enemy, but as life's most brilliant invention. Because it gives life urgency. It strips away the unimportant. It reminds us of what truly matters. In one of his final public speeches, he said, "No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life." He wasn't glorifying death. He was acknowledging it with humility, with acceptance, with understanding that it gives life its shape. Without endings, there would be no urgency. Without limits, there would be no meaning. Jobs began to live with a quieter heart. He still worked, still created, still demanded excellence, but there was a softness now. A recognition that perfection is not the absence of flaws, but the presence of sincerity. He became more deliberate with his words, more grateful with his time. He spent hours reflecting not on profits or products, but on purpose. What had it all meant? What was it all for? He began to see that his true legacy was not in the machines he built, but in the experiences they enabled. Not in the wealth he earned, but in the moments of wonder he had inspired in others. Realized that every human being, no matter how powerful, is a temporary traveler passing through this world for a short while, leaving behind traces of thought, of love, of work, of kindness. And that realization, as simple as it sounds, changes everything, because when you remember that time is limited, you begin to see differently. You stop rushing toward what fades and start cherishing what lasts. You stop arguing over small things and begin to value the quiet miracle of being alive. You stop seeking control and start practicing gratitude. For Jobs, gratitude became his greatest discovery. He saw that gratitude turns even ordinary moments into treasures. It transforms work into devotion and presence into peace. He had spent decades trying to shape life through design, but in his final years, he began to see that life itself is already a design perfect in its imperfection, balanced between joy and pain, held together by time and loss. He spoke once of connecting the dots, how the events in life only make sense in hindsight. He said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward." That idea carried him through his last years. He began to trust that even the painful moments had meaning, that the setbacks, the rejections, the failures were not accidents, but steps on a path he could only now see clearly. This acceptance brought him peace. It didn't mean he stopped striving. It meant he stopped fighting what was beyond his reach. He learned to let go, not in defeat, but in understanding. There's a moment that comes to everyone facing mortality, a moment when you realize that everything external will eventually pass. Your possessions, your work, your achievements, they remain for a time, but not forever. What remains, truly, is what you gave, your sincerity, your effort, your kindness, your contribution to others. And this, perhaps, is the quiet wisdom that his illness revealed to him. That legacy is not about being remembered. It's about having lived rightly. It's not about fame. It's about integrity. It's not about changing the world. It's about honoring the small part of it that was entrusted to you. Jobs began to live with that humility. He spent time with his children, spoke gently with his wife, and, according to those close to him, often fell silent for long stretches, as if simply listening to life itself. His words became fewer, but more meaningful. His ambitions remained, but they were guided by a softer hand. He came to understand something profound, that death does not end meaning. It reveals it. Because everything you truly are, your compassion, your patience, your honesty, your care, cannot die. They remain, carried in the lives you've touched, in the words you've spoken, in the things you've built, with love. Jobs once described life as fragile, like glass, beautiful not because it lasts, but because it doesn't. He said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." Those words are easy to quote, but they carry a truth that only experience can reveal. That time, once spent, never returns, and therefore, every moment deserves intention. In his final years, he learned to live slowly. He spent mornings simply watching the light move across a room. He noticed the texture of sound, the rhythm of silence. He saw that life's beauty was never in the grand moments of achievement, but in the quiet ones that asked nothing from him. He once said, "Being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed at night knowing we've done something wonderful, that's what matters to me." It's a statement both simple and profound. Because it's not wealth that measures a life, but contribution. Not applause, but sincerity. And that's what death taught him, that the goal is not to escape mortality, but to live wisely within it. To live in a way that, when the end comes, you can look back without regret. To have built things that mattered, spoken words that healed, and left behind traces of kindness in the world. In those final months, he no longer spoke of control. He spoke of acceptance. He no longer demanded perfection. He sought peace. He no longer measured success by what he achieved, but by how deeply he had lived. He faced his illness with quiet courage, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had finally made peace with what he couldn't change. That is true strength, not the power to conquer life, but the humility to embrace it. He passed away in October 2011. And though the world mourned the loss of a visionary, perhaps the greater legacy was the man he had become by the end, not the inventor, not the icon, but the human being who had learned to see the beauty in impermanence, the gift in limitation, and the meaning in letting go. His life, like every life, was brief. But in that briefness, he discovered the essence of what it means to be alive, to strive with purpose, to fail with grace, to love without fear, and to depart without regret. Because in the end, mortality is not a curse. It is a reminder that time is sacred, that creation is a responsibility, and that our worth is not measured by what we control, but by what we give. And perhaps that is what Steve Jobs finally understood, that the greatest act of design is not shaping the world outside you, but shaping the heart within you. The body fades, the titles vanish, the creations evolve or disappear. But character, the sincerity behind every choice, the humility behind every success, the gratitude behind every day remains. In the silence of his final moments, he was said to have looked at his family, smiled softly, and whispered his last words, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." No one truly knows what he saw. But perhaps it was simply wonder. The same wonder he had chased all his life now seemed clearly, without fear, without ambition, without need. And maybe that is what every human being is meant to find. Before the end, the ability to look at life and see it as it always was. Temporary, fragile, fleeting, and yet breathtakingly beautiful. Part 9. The Legacy of Imperfection. Legacy. It's a word that often sounds heavy, as if it belongs only to the great, to the ones whose names are remembered, whose work is studied, whose stories become lessons. But in truth, every human being leaves a legacy. Some write it in books or inventions, others in the hearts of those they've touched. Some through words, others through silence. Steve Jobs' legacy is often spoken of in the language of technology: the iPhone, the iMac, the revolution of design and simplicity. But perhaps his truest legacy isn't something you can hold in your hand. It's something you feel in the way you look at the world, in the way you ask, why not? In the quiet courage to build something better, even when no one believes you can. Still, Jobs' story is not one of perfection. It is one of contradictions, brilliance and harshness, clarity and impatience, vision and blindness. He changed the world, but he also hurt people. He built beauty, but sometimes lived without gentleness. He could inspire a team to create something extraordinary, and in the same breath, leave someone in tears. It would be easy to divide his story to call him either a hero or a tyrant, a genius or a failure. But life is never that clean. People are never that simple. The truth is, Steve Jobs was both light and shadow, and his legacy, like all human legacies, is made of both. We live in a world obsessed with flawlessness. We idolize success, erase mistakes, and pretend that greatness comes without struggle. But every great life carries a quiet mess beneath its surface: the doubts, the regrets, the things we wish we'd done differently. And maybe that's what makes a legacy real. Not perfection, but honesty. Jobs' life reminds us that to create something meaningful doesn't require being perfect, it requires being true. He had moments of cruelty, but also moments of deep kindness, moments of pride, and moments of humility. He was complex, like every human soul. The people who worked with him said that even in his hardest moments, you could feel his sincerity, his belief that what they were doing mattered, that he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing meaning. He wanted to make things that would last, not physically, but emotionally. Things that would remind people that even in a world filled with noise, beauty still matters. That's why his legacy continues to move people, not because of the devices themselves, but because of the philosophy behind them. That care matters, that simplicity matters, that intention matters. And yet, his life also warns us that vision without compassion can become tyranny, that obsession without balance can lead to pain, and that even the brightest minds must learn the humility to rest. His story teaches us that greatness and gentleness must walk together, that innovation without empathy is hollow, and that success without sincerity is short-lived. Jobs never claimed to be perfect. In fact, near the end of his life, he admitted that he had failed in many ways. He said that he wished he had spent more time with his children, that he had been more patient, more understanding. Those words do not diminish him, they humanize him, because the ability to admit one's faults is itself a kind of wisdom. It's a reminder that growth doesn't end with success, it continues, quietly, until the very end. And that is perhaps the real legacy of Steve Jobs. Not the empire he built, but the transformation he underwent. Not the perfection he achieved, but the humility he learned. Not the control he gained, but the acceptance he found. In that way, his story is a mirror for us all. Because we, too, live between creation and imperfection, between vision and failure, between control and surrender. We, too, want to leave something behind, something good, something meaningful. And like Jobs, we are reminded that what endures is not how flawlessly we lived, but how sincerely we tried. He once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." At first, it sounds like ambition, a bold declaration of power. But if you listen closely, there's something softer in those words, something humble, because every life, no matter how small, leaves a mark, not because of size, but because of sincerity. We leave dents in the universe every time we show kindness, every time we build something that helps, every time we forgive, every time we care. The universe, after all, does not measure impact by scale, but by intent. Steve Jobs' life, in all its brilliance and imperfection, reminds us of this simple truth, that greatness is not a straight line, but a winding path between who we are and who we are trying to become. He did not design perfection. He designed a reflection of his journey of clarity, of struggle, of longing, of growth, and that is why people still find meaning in his story. Because his legacy is not only the story of Apple. It is the story of a human being trying, failing, learning, and striving to make sense of life's shortness through the act of creation. And maybe that's all any of us can do, to take the time we are given, the talents we have, and use them to bring something good into the world. Not because we will be remembered, but because it is right. Legacy, then, is not built in public. It is built in private, in the unseen acts of care, in the quiet decisions to do what is good, in the moments when no one is watching, but you choose integrity anyway. It's built in the patience to listen, the humility to learn, the courage to start again after failure. And when we live like that, our imperfections don't erase our failure. Impact, they deepen it. Because people don't remember perfect figures, they remember the ones who were real. Jobs' story endures not because he was flawless, but because he was flawed and still strived for beauty. Because he was restless and still sought peace. Because he was human and still tried, every day, to create something good. And so, when we speak of his legacy, perhaps we should not speak of computers or companies. We should speak of the reminder his life gives us, that what we build in this world, in our work, our relationships, our choices, reflects the state of our heart. If there is care, it shows. If there is arrogance, it shows. If there is sincerity, it shines. And maybe that's the only kind of immortality there is, not in being remembered by millions, but in leaving behind traces of goodness in the lives we've touched. Steve Jobs was not perfect, but he cared deeply. He dreamed endlessly, and he worked tirelessly to bring harmony into a chaotic world. That doesn't make him a saint. It makes him human. And that, in itself, is a legacy worth honoring, because in the end, perfection fades, but sincerity, that quiet, steady light, remains. Part 11. The Illusion of Control Revisited. In the beginning of his journey, Steve Jobs believed that control was the key to greatness. He thought that if he could shape every detail, every process, every outcome, then perfection would follow. And for a while, it seemed true. He built systems, organized people, and crafted products that seemed flawless. But the longer he lived, the more he saw that control, no matter how complete, is always temporary. He learned that you can direct effort but not destiny. You can design structure but not life. You can plan every moment and still be surprised by what the world brings. When illness arrived, when failure humbled him, when people he loved left or changed, he faced a truth that every human soul must eventually accept, that control is an illusion we cling to because we fear uncertainty. And yet, uncertainty is where life breathes. It is where growth begins. It is the space in which we discover patience, trust, and grace. Jobs' early years were filled with tension. He wanted to build the world. But later, he realized that life is not something to build. It's something to listen to. He began to see control differently, not as domination, but as discipline. Not as the power to command, but as the humility to focus. He once said that focus means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that tempt you. And that kind of focus is a gentler kind of control, the control of the self, not of others. In this way, He learned that the highest form of mastery is not power over the world, but patience within it. Because the world doesn't obey us, it moves on its own, mysterious, unpredictable, and full of meaning we can only glimpse. When he accepted that, something softened in him. He began to live with more calm. He began to work with more peace. He began to see that life's beauty lies not in bending it to our will, but in walking with it, with awareness, gratitude, and humility. And so, by the end of his life, Steve Jobs had come full circle. The man who once sought control had discovered acceptance. The perfectionist had found stillness. The designer had learned to appreciate the design that was never his to draw. Perhaps that is the final lesson of control, that we were never meant to rule life, but to honor it, to give our best effort, and then to let go. Because when you release the need to control, you begin to see the truth beneath it all. That everything you've ever built, everything you've ever loved, was never truly yours to own, only yours to care for a little while. Part 12. The Weight of Time. It moves quietly, indifferent to our plans, patient with our delays, merciful with our mistakes. For most of his life, Steve Jobs treated time as a resource, something to be used, measured, managed. He filled it with action, creation, intensity. He was always moving, always building, always reaching. But time is not a machine. It does not bend to will. It flows with a rhythm of its own, unseen, unstoppable, and perfectly fair. In his final years, Jobs began to understand time not as an enemy, but as a teacher. He realized that every moment carries a weight, a quiet responsibility to live it well. He once said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." It was one of his most famous lines, but it came from something deeply personal, the realization that every borrowed second is a chance to choose what truly matters. Before his illness, he lived as if time could stretch endlessly. But once confronted with its boundaries, he began to see its beauty, not because it lasted, but because it didn't. He discovered that the value of time is not measured by how much we do, but by how much awareness we bring to what we do. That presence is more powerful than speed. That stillness can teach more than ambition. The world often tells us that success means moving fast, achieving more, always being one step ahead. But time teaches a gentler truth, that life is not a race, but a trust. You are given only a small portion of it, and one day that portion will end. The question is not how long it lasts, but how honestly it was lived. Jobs began to live differently when he realized this. He spent more time listening. He noticed things he once ignored: the rhythm of rain on glass, the laughter of his children, the silence between words. He found that life's most meaningful moments are often the smallest ones, the ones that pass so quietly we miss them if we're not paying attention. Time reveals the truth of everything. It shows us what lasts and what fades. It softens pride and strengthens gratitude. It humbles the powerful and comforts the broken. And as it moves, it asks us a single, silent question: what are you doing with me? Because time is not our possession. It's our test. It measures not the wealth we gain, but the sincerity we carry. Not the power we hold, but the patience we show. Not the moments we count, but the moments we honor. Jobs once described creativity as just connecting things. Perhaps that applies to time as well. Because when we look back, the moments that matter most are the ones that connect: a word of kindness, an act of honesty, a quiet decision to do what is right. Those are the moments that hold weight, the ones that echo beyond our years. In the rush of achievement, it is easy to forget that life is temporary. We act as if we have endless time to forgive, to love, to begin again. But one day, time will remind us that everything we postponed was the very thing that mattered most. Jobs used to speak of urgency, not the frantic kind, but the mindful kind. He urged people to act, not because they might die soon, but because life is happening now. He understood that procrastination is not just delay, it's a form of blindness, a refusal to see how precious each day is. When you remember that time is limited, you begin to use it differently. You speak more gently. You forgive faster. You waste less energy on things that fade. You think before you act, and you thank before you complain. That is the wisdom of time, that everything temporary points us toward what is eternal in value. Truth, compassion, integrity, love. Jobs once said, "Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become." He didn't mean to glorify emotion. He meant that when time is short, clarity often lives in simplicity. The heart knows what the mind forgets. He learned that the mind calculates time, but the heart feels it. The mind looks for what's efficient, but the heart recognizes what's meaningful. And so, as his time grew shorter, Jobs became more deliberate. He stopped trying to stretch time. He started trying to fill it well. He realized that the value of a minute is not in how much you fit into it, but in whether it held truth. Because one honest moment is worth more than a lifetime of distraction. Time humbles us, but it also redeems us. It gives us the gift of reflection, the chance to see how far we've come, how much we've learned, and how deeply we've changed. When we look back, we rarely remember the deadlines, the numbers, the schedules. We remember the faces, the laughter, the quiet evenings, the small kindnesses that seemed invisible at the time. That is the real weight of time. Not heaviness, but depth. Every second carries the chance to live with intention, to speak with care, to act with conscience. And when those seconds are used well, they leave a trace not on calendars, but on hearts. In his final reflections, Steve Jobs understood that time is not an enemy to be conquered. It is a companion to be respected. It asks nothing from us but awareness. And in exchange, it gives us everything: the chance to grow, to change, to live, to leave something good behind. He once said, "If today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do today?" It's a question that humbles anyone who asks it honestly. Because when you live with that awareness, you stop wasting time on what doesn't nourish your soul. Time, in the end, is not the distance between birth and death. It is the space in which you learn to see clearly. And perhaps the only real measure of a life well lived is not how long it lasted, but how deeply it was understood. Part 13. The Quiet Power of Purpose. Purpose. It's a word we hear so often that we forget its weight. But for Steve Jobs, purpose was never abstract. It was the invisible thread running through every decision, every risk, every creation. He didn't start Apple just to build computers. He started it to give shape to an idea that technology could be simple, human, and filled with care. From the outside, his drive looked like ambition. But inside, it was something quieter, a longing for meaning, a need to create things that made sense, that reflected thought, precision, and respect. He once said, "The only way to do great work is to love what you do." That sentence became a mantra for millions. But few understood what he truly meant. He wasn't talking about passion as excitement. He meant commitment. He meant showing up even when the work feels invisible, even when the results are uncertain. Because real purpose isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand recognition. It moves quietly, steady, consistent, devoted. Jobs had seen what happens when ambition runs without purpose. He saw people chase profit and fame, only to lose direction. He saw companies that built everything except meaning, and he refused to live that way. He believed that every act of creation should begin with a simple question: why? Why does this matter? Why is this worth building? Why will it make life better? Not easier, not faster, but better. That question guided his work like a compass. It forced him to remove what was unnecessary, to focus on the essence, to choose clarity over complexity. But purpose isn't only about work. It's about the way we live, the way we treat others, the way we make decisions when no one is watching, the way we carry our responsibilities. Jobs learned this slowly, through both success and failure. In his early years, He thought purpose meant achievement. He thought it was something you proved. But as time passed, he saw that true purpose isn't something you earn. It's something you uncover by paying attention to what moves you, what humbles you, what gives you peace. He once said that every morning he looked in the mirror and asked himself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do? If the answer was no, too many days in a row, he knew something had to change. That was his way of measuring purpose, not by success, but by sincerity. In the quiet of his later years, he began to understand that purpose has two sides. The first is the outer purpose, the things we build, the careers we shape, the goals we pursue. The second is the inner purpose, the state of heart with which we live. And the second always defines the first. Without inner purpose, outer achievement feels empty. Without sincerity, even brilliance fades. He learned that a product built without meaning is just another object. But a product built with purpose carries presence. You can feel it, the care, the patience, the honesty in its design. And if that is true for what we create, it must also be true for who we become. Purpose gives form to life the way design gives form to matter. It turns noise into direction. It gives weight to every decision. It transforms repetition into devotion. That's why Jobs believed that excellence is moral, not technical. Because to do something with care is to honor the opportunity to do it at all. He often spoke about craftsmen, the ones who build things that no one else will ever see. He admired their integrity, their commitment to invisible perfection, because they understood something rare, that purpose doesn't depend on witnesses. It depends on conscience. And that is the quiet power of purpose. It shapes you from within. It teaches you patience. It protects you from distraction. It reminds you that meaning comes not from applause, but from alignment, when what you do, what you believe, and what you value all move in the same direction. Jobs' life was proof that outer success means nothing if it isn't connected to inner truth. He built empires, but his peace only came when his heart caught up with his work, when creation stopped being a competition and became an act of gratitude. Because purpose is not about doing more. It's about doing what matters and doing it well. He once said that life is fragile and that the only way to live fully is to make every moment count. That doesn't mean rushing through life. It means treating each day as a chance to do something that reflects care. Purpose doesn't demand grand gestures. It asks for sincerity in the small ones, a kind word, an honest effort, a moment of real attention. In the end, Jobs discovered that purpose isn't something you find. It's something you build, one honest choice at a time. And when you build your life on that foundation, everything changes. Work becomes service. Success becomes gratitude. Time becomes sacred. Because the quiet power of purpose isn't that it makes you unstoppable, it's that it makes you whole. Part 14. The Art of Presence. There is a kind of intelligence that comes not from knowing more, but from noticing more. From slowing down enough to actually see what is already in front of you. Steve Jobs spent most of his life chasing the future. Always thinking ahead. Always reaching for the next idea, the next product, the next breakthrough. But as the years passed, he began to realize that the greatest breakthrough was not technological. It was human. It was the ability to be present. Presence, the art of being fully where you are. It sounds simple, yet it may be the hardest thing a person can learn. We live surrounded by noise. Screens, tasks, notifications, constant motion, constant distraction. We confuse movement for meaning. We call it progress. Jobs once said that focus is about saying no. But presence goes even further. It's about saying yes to the moment itself, to what is real right now, to the small, quiet things that exist only for those who slow down enough to see them. He often spoke about simplicity in design, but later he began to see simplicity as a way of living. To him, being present was like refining a product, removing all that was unnecessary until only the essence remained. And that essence, in life as in design, is awareness. He would walk slowly through his garden, stopping to touch the leaves, to look at the sky, to breathe deeply. He said that when you stop trying to hold on to time, you begin to actually feel it, because presence isn't just stillness, it's a kind of seeing. It's understanding that this moment, this breath, this silence is already complete. Jobs once described life as a brief spark between two eternities. That spark, he realized, wasn't meant to be stretched or controlled. It was meant to be felt. When he worked with his teams, he sometimes told them to put away their screens and just look at the object in front of them. "Do you feel it?" he would ask. "Does it speak to you?" He wasn't talking about the device. He was talking about the presence behind the work, the invisible quality that you can't fake, because presence leaves fingerprints. You can sense when something was built with care, when someone's attention was whole. He began to see that this same truth applies to people. You can feel when someone is truly there with you, when their eyes listen, when their silence comforts, when their attention is gentle. Presence doesn't need words. It doesn't even need understanding. It simply needs awareness, the choice to give the moment and the person in front of you the gift of your full attention. In an age of endless distraction, that kind of attention has become rare. But it is also the most powerful form of respect. Jobs once said that design is not just what it looks like or feels like, it's how it works. Maybe presence is the same. It's not about what it looks like on the outside, but how it works inside you. It changes how you move, how you think, how you connect. When you are truly present, you stop trying to control every detail. You listen more. You notice beauty in things you once ignored. You speak with care because you realize that every word shapes a moment that will never return. Presence teaches patience. It humbles pride. It slows the restless mind until it learns to rest inside the simplicity of now. Jobs once described music as the silence between the notes. He said that what gives sound its beauty is not the noise, but the pause. Life is the same. Its beauty is found in the pauses, the spaces between one moment and the next, the stillness that allows everything else to have meaning. He discovered this late in life, but once he did, it transformed the way he saw everything. He no longer rushed from idea to idea. He began to focus on fewer things, but with more sincerity. He started to see presence as an act of care for himself, for others, for the work he left behind. And maybe that's what he had been searching for all along. Not perfection, not immortality, but presence. The ability to be fully alive, fully aware, fully human. Presence doesn't make life easier. It makes it real. It teaches you to meet each moment as it is without running from it, without forcing it, without wishing it away. It reminds you that peace is not found by adding more, but by noticing what is already here. He once told a young designer, "The hardest part isn't finding the right answer. It's noticing the right question." And that is what presence does. It gives you eyes to see what was hidden, not because it wasn't there, but because you were too busy to notice. Presence reveals the miracle in the ordinary. It turns small gestures into moments of grace. It turns work into worship. It turns living into gratitude. When you are present, you stop measuring life by what you achieve. You begin to measure it by how much attention you gave, how much care you offered, how fully you appreciated what was placed in your path. That is the art of presence. To live awake, to act with gentleness, to see the sacred in the simple. Jobs may have built tools that changed the world, but his final lesson was simpler: to put them down once in a while, to sit in silence, to listen to life itself. Because the greatest creation is not found in the products we make, but in the awareness we bring to the moments we live. And when that awareness becomes habit, when attention becomes devotion, you begin to see that every breath, every heartbeat, every sunrise is a quiet invitation to be here, fully, completely, gratefully. Part 15. The Human Legacy. When a life ends, what remains? Not the possessions, not the applause, not even the name, which time will eventually soften into memory. What remains are the traces of who we were, the marks of our care, the echoes of our choices, the small pieces of ourselves we left in others. Steve Jobs left behind technology, yes. But that was never the true legacy. His true legacy was human. The reminder that care matters, that simplicity has meaning, that devotion can turn even ordinary work into something timeless. He once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." But maybe that dent was never meant to be large or loud. Maybe it was meant to be precise, intentional, filled with purpose. A mark not of power, but of presence. In every person's life, there is a moment when the desire to leave something behind meets the realization that everything we build will one day fade. That's not a tragedy. It's a truth, a reminder that legacy is not about what outlives us, but what lives through us. Jobs' story teaches this clearly, that greatness is not about how far you go, but about how truthfully you walk the path that is yours. He was brilliant, but he was also flawed. He built beauty, but often wrestled with peace. He inspired millions, yet struggled to understand himself. And, in that contradiction, he became what every human being is a reflection of both light and shadow. He learned, as we all must, that the measure of a life is not perfection, but sincerity. Because sincerity endures. It transcends achievement. It outlives memory. He once said that death clears out the old to make room for the new. Perhaps the same is true within us. Each ending, each loss, each failure, each goodbye makes space for growth, for clarity, for renewal. We spend our lives trying to hold on, to control, to preserve. But in the end, what truly matters is what we were willing to give away. Our time, our effort, our kindness, our love. Jobs learned this lesson slowly. He began as a perfectionist. He ended as a human being. He started by shaping the world. He ended by learning to shape his heart. And that is the essence of the human legacy, to move from control to acceptance, from ambition to purpose, from noise to silence. He showed us that creation can be an act of worship, that work can be a form of gratitude, that beauty can be a way of saying thank you for the time we are given. He showed us that simplicity is not emptiness, it's clarity, that discipline is not harshness, it's respect, that imperfection is not failure, it's humanity. Every generation inherits two gifts, the world as it is, and the chance to make it better. Jobs took that chance seriously, and whether you agree with him or not, you cannot deny his sincerity in the pursuit. But his story also reminds us that changing the world means nothing if we lose our peace in the process, that progress without compassion is hollow, that intelligence without humility is blind. He was proof that even those who change the world must one day face the stillness of their own heart. And in that stillness, he found something he had been seeking all along, not success, not control, but understanding. He understood that every breath is borrowed, that every day is a chance to begin again, that the most important things are often the simplest: to be kind, to be patient, to be grateful, to be aware. The legacy of a human being is not written in what they invented, but in what they awakened in themselves and in others. When Jobs spoke, people didn't only hear his ideas. They felt his conviction, his belief that life could be better, simpler, truer. That belief, not the devices, is what remains, because every great life leaves behind more than inventions. It leaves behind questions. How will we use our time? What will we create with the gifts we've been given? And most of all, what kind of person will we become while doing it? He once said, "Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition." But maybe courage is not only in following. Maybe it's also in pausing, in listening deeply to the quiet guidance that comes when the world is silent. That kind of courage doesn't shout. It lives quietly, in integrity, in patience, in compassion. That's the kind of courage that outlasts fame, that lives beyond achievement. And so, Steve Jobs' final legacy is not his success, but his humanity. The reminder that we all carry the same choice: to live distracted or to live awake, to create carelessly or to create with love, to pass through the world lightly or to leave behind goodness that helps others see more clearly. Because in the end, every life becomes a reflection of what it cared about most. And the heart, more than history, records everything. Jobs' heart, restless, curious, flawed, sincere, became his greatest creation. And through his story, we are reminded that our own hearts can create something beautiful too. Maybe not on a global stage, maybe not with technology or invention, but in the way we live, in the way we love, in the way we treat the small, ordinary moments as sacred. That is the true human legacy. Not to change everything, but to leave the part of the world you touch a little lighter, a little clearer, a little more kind. And if that's all we manage, then we, too, have done something extraordinary. Because in the end, what remains is not what we built, but what we became. And that quietly, humbly, gratefully is enough.